Jon Rappoport. Welcome to the Solari Report.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Make America Great vision, the people involved and how to think about them, and how we as either citizens or members of the independent media assess how they're doing and hold them accountable to performance. Joseph and I did an interview called The Trump Transition last week. And in it, I described both sort of the oligarchs and the establishment. I divided them into three groups. One was the pigs, and those are the people who, will take whatever they can get. One was the Scaredy Cats, who are just, putting their money in offshore havens and getting ready to take care of themselves when everything goes down. And the third I described as the Titanic Turners, which is the guys who say, come on, let's get on the Titanic and turn it before it's too late. And I think a lot of what I'm interested in doing is seeing citizens and the independent media, and my first focus is the independent media, give the pigs a really hard time, shame the Scaredy Cats, and then help the Titanic Turners. When you look at the independent media so far, they're having a hard time differentiating between who's who.
Yeah. Who does this guy that he's appointing represent? Is this some neocon interest about war, surveillance state, tightening, militarizing police forces? Or is this somebody that is genuinely standing for law and order, but not in some overpowering way?
Right. And the other problem we have, it's fair to say that the president and the administration is not in control of the deep state, because a lot of the organizations in the deep state control the day-to-day operations. So the government doesn't have information sovereignty or financial sovereignty. You're dependent on a lot of these private companies and private banks to implement everything you're doing.
Yeah. That's quite a Titanic to turn around.
You got to pick your fights. And so we're going to see Titanic Turners, out of 10 fights they figure they can do and win 5, and they're going to let 5 slide, and that's going to frustrate us. Well, let's talk about money, because the important thing to understand about the change that we're looking at is it's very much driven by the timing of what is happening with the fact that we've lived in a world of both cheap money and, in fact, cheap natural resources, and the cheap money is coming to an end. We have reached the limit of borrowing it or printing it for almost free, so our cost of capital is rising beyond a level that can be justified by many of the uses of that money. It's like you get a credit card, you run up your credit card to $20,000, you're paying 3%, suddenly they jack the rates up to 20% on your existing debt. Everybody and everything, from you and I and how we use credit cards to how the federal government prints and borrows money, is going to change, and it has a radical impact. So let's go through some definitions before we go into this. Okay, well, let's start off with bonds, because governments finance with bonds, and bond is an IOU that is used when you're typically doing large amounts of money, but it is treated as a security, which means you can buy and sell. If you issue the bond to me, I'm the buyer, you're the seller, and you're the issuer, and I'm the holder. Most bonds are liquid, not all. There's some which are not. Liquid means it can be transferred.
And then you can actually trade that or sell that.
Yes. I can borrow against it too.
Right.
So you have a financial liability, I have a financial asset.
Got it.
Governments issue bonds. So the U.S. government issues treasury bonds. Municipal governments issue municipal bonds. Corporations also issue bonds. They're called corporate bonds. If you talk about government bonds around the world, you'll hear the word sovereign bonds, because it's issued by a sovereign government. And when we talk about how much debt has been issued, we have borrowed tremendously against the future.
The government has borrowed tremendously against the future.
Generally, when a government borrows, that borrowing is collateralized by the obligation of the citizens of that sovereign government to make good. Because, in fact, we're on the hook under law for that debt. Let's talk about equity. So the equity is the value of your asset minus your debt. If you and I buy a home for $200,000, housing prices go up, it's worth $300,000. And we decide to take money out so we get a home equity loan or a mortgage for $200,000. So now we have a $300,000 house, we have a $200,000 mortgage, and we have $100,000 of equity in our home. So then let's say the prices collapse and the value of the house goes down to $150,000. So our equity is now negative. Sometimes people refer to equity as the equity value of the home or the company, but they can also be referring to the stock market value if that company is owned by public shareholders. So then let's talk about returns, because it's really important when you look at the U.S. government, what's happening now, to understand the issues related to return on investment and cost of capital. So when something has a positive return, a dollar turns into $1.10 every year. When it's negative, a dollar turns into 90 cents.
Right.
If you look at the return on investment to taxpayers, it gets more complicated. You can't estimate return on investment to taxpayer unless you can look at performance of government investment by place. Governments are really in the business of place-based investment. But if you pay your taxes to the federal government, you don't get an annual report that shows you, contiguous to the area that you vote for political representation, what the return on investment to taxpayers was from the money you spent, which conceptually is relatively easy to do. And, that information is some of the biggest secrets in America because it is phenomenally important for a control mechanism. At Hamilton Securities, when relational databases first came out, what we discovered was that much of the positive return on investment to private companies came as a result of subsidy that had a deeply negative return on investment to taxpayers. That's why I used to call it the tapeworm. It was basically sucking wealth out of the economy and shrinking the pie.
So in other words, I as a taxpayer am now thinking about, okay, I pay this much tax every year. What am I getting for it?
Right. The question for you is, are you better off chipping in and paying them to build the roads? Or are you better off keeping the money and, building your own driveway yourself? Is the return on investment to taxpayers positive or negative? Total economic return. If we were to look at the whole financial ecosystem and say, okay, let's decide, a group of investors and the government get together and they say, we want to build a convention center. The question on that convention center is, will it really improve the gross product of that place? Will it make the GNP go up? Will it be good for the environment? Will it create jobs? So in theory, what we're looking to do is take the total economic return and have it be positive in a way that increases return for investors. You want the return to the taxpayer to be positive. And then finally, there's everybody else. And I call that the return to the network. And what you're looking for is a positive four ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if you look at what's going on right now, too often we have a positive return to investor and a negative to all the others. And the reason that is now hurting investors is because if the parasite liquidates the host, no more host to liquidate.
Mm-hmm.
And, the pigs have been too piggy. And now the party's over. For example, we see Trump yapping about how much Boeing is going to be paid to do new planes for Air Force One. And his quote is, we want Boeing to make a lot of money, but not this much. And what he's saying is, you can do this function for a lot less, and you can do it in a way that Boeing can still make plenty of money. We want to have positive returns. But he's saying, your positive return is coming at a negative return to taxpayer. That's not okay. That's what he's saying. Okay. What he's trying to do is infuse the culture with the notion that every dollar is important and we got to get the best deal for the dollar that we can. And I'll tell you, John, there's no bigger job in America than, changing that culture.
How about an example where the taxpayer is paying taxes, the federal government is investing in some project, and the overall effect is bad?
So when I was at Hamilton Securities Group, the Clinton administration was committed to doing welfare reform. And we started a program to teach data servicing. And what we discovered was that the average woman with 1.8 children in the Washington, D.C. area was costing the U.S. government $55,000 plus to basically keep this person on government benefits. And that person was spending 35 hours a week dealing with the bureaucracy of managing their benefits. And for $10,000 to $25,000 in a relatively short period of time, we could teach them how to earn $18,000 to $25,000 being a data servicing worker. And they would then be paying taxes to D.C. and the federal government instead of costing $55,000 a year. Let me keep going. If you look at the food stamp program, 37 states, the last time I looked, were outsourcing their food stamp payment service and technical and customer support to J.P. Morgan, who is teleporting the data servicing to Asia. We're paying literally millions of people in the United States to not work when they could be doing the job that we're paying somebody in Asia. So when Trump says America first, that's what he means. Let me keep going. You have tons of small farms in Tennessee that were put out of business by food safety rules. We rigged both cost of capital and the regulations to basically wipe out small farms. You've used the food safety rules to engineer the agricultural system into the big guys. And now they are taking their $1 billion of food stamps and going down to Walmart and buying food that has been shipped in from 2,000 miles away, which is making them sick. You re-engineer the food safety rules to something infinitely more intelligent and sensible, and you're going to get millions of small farms propping up and selling food locally. And so those people not only are not going to be on food stamps, but they're going to be eating much healthier, fresher food. And they're going to have jobs. So let me keep going to my favorite example, which is prisons.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So in 1996, the General Accounting Office did a study and said the all-in cost of one person being in federal, state, and local prison, including all construction costs, full bureaucracy, all costs that normally aren't in the cost estimates you read in the paper, was $154,000 a year for each prisoner. And for those who don't believe me, I've written an online book called Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits, and it's all there. And the documentation that goes into the hundreds of thousands of pages, it's all there. Anyway, when you put a person in prison who could be a taxpayer, you take somebody who could generate $2,000 to $5,000 a year in tax money to someone who's costing the taxpayers $154,000 a year. So that's what I call a positive return to investors, a negative return to taxpayers, a negative total economic return, and a negative return to network. Everybody's worse off except the investors. If you look at the current wealth in the United States, John, it's 1% of what it could be. I mean, in a generation or two, we could literally multiply 100 times the wealth in this country if you were free to optimize.
How much of what you're talking about do you think that Trump understands?
I don't think that Trump necessarily understands the detail of some of the aspects that I talk about, but I think Trump is 100% clear on the opportunity I'm describing. And I think that Goldman Sachs is 100% clear on that opportunity. And I think Warren Buffett, who's one of the lead investors in Goldman Sachs, I am 100% certain is 100% clear because he's got his whole operation lined up to take advantage of it. Now, before we all get excited about that, the danger is, depending on how you do it, if you let the pigs run that opportunity, they're just going to do another round of piggy stealing and we're going to end up as feudal serfs.
I mean, when you say things like Goldman Sachs and Buffett understand this, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in favor of it. It just means they understand that it could happen. I mean, it's in the realm of possibility, but it doesn't mean that they're for it.
This is the single largest capital gains outside of warfare that I've ever seen in my life. You can take advantage of that capital gain in a way where the investors take everything. But you can also do it in a way that is positive four-way. And I believe the role of independent media is to make sure that it's four-way and we don't let the pigs have their way. If Goldman Sachs, Warren Buffett see it and operationalize it, but the independent media and municipal leaders and small business leaders and the average citizen doesn't see it, we won't get the kind of positive total economic return we can get if everybody sees it.
There is an opportunity here because of the result of the election, Trump's rejection of the media in particular, and the fact that Hillary Clinton is not going to occupy the White House. There is this opportunity, and independent researchers, investigators, media people, citizens, everybody absolutely has to do whatever they can to take advantage of this opportunity.
One of the reasons that the independent media must do this is if you're a Titanic Turner, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can't talk about. You can't talk about the black budget. You can't talk about it's important for me to get the mob on board here. Because so many of these things are not politically acceptable. So the Titanic Turners need someone to be the bad guy about the sensitive or unfashionable issues. That's number one. So the other thing is the Titanic Turners need help policing and putting the pigs in a corner. Because if you're in government, it's hard to do. They're dangerous. They kill people. They kill people's kids. They get control files. They don't play nice. And so one of the things you'll see since the alternative media or the independent media started commenting on the nominees, right now I watch them beating up on the Titanic Turners and ignoring the pigs. And that's very dangerous. You got to be able to differentiate. And finally, the independent media is doing a lot of fear porn stuff that only encourages Titanic Turners to become scaredy cats and run. We need to find a way of changing this where the pie gets bigger, but everybody who's a productive member of society can move out and take advantage of that. So there's an expression, privatization is when you take a government asset or operation and transfer some or all ownership and responsibility to the private sector. Privatization is when I sell it for its market value. If instead I do a process where a building that's worth $1 million gets sold for $100,000 to my friends, that's what I call piratiization. Okay? It's a deal that doesn't happen in market.
Right.
One of the dangers here is you bring the capital back and you leave it to the pigs and you go too fast, you do too much, you don't design it properly, and you end up with privatization.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Essentially, you need thousands of entrepreneurs and small business, millions, in fact, all over the country, seeing this opportunity and going to operationalize it, because that is what will create the jobs. Big companies aren't going to create the jobs. Mm-hmm. There's one other thing I want to mention before we close, and that is the biggest disadvantage of you and me or a small business or entrepreneur up against the big guys is they're using illegal surveillance. In other words, we walk into a neighborhood and I can't listen to my neighbor's telephone conversations and read his emails, but they can.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The problem Trump and his players are going to have, is the intelligence agencies and all sorts of other private parties going to be listening to all their they literally have to go, downstairs in the bunker under the White House to have a private conversation, and even that might not work.
Mm-hmm.
the playing field is very unlevel when it comes to intelligence. So one of the things we have to think about as we move to operationalize, is how, as an entrepreneur, small business, you can start or engage in a conspiracy where the big guys are playing dirty on, on surveillance and predatory practices.
That's a very good thought to begin with. Telling the truth is one way.
Right.
It helps a lot because people can recognize that. And they say, whoa, this is an entrepreneur that I want to find out more about because he or she is starting out by telling the truth. And that's attractive, so let's see what they have to offer.
Right. Jon, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to have this conversation because if we can get this to the point where it's easily understood by many and they can integrate it with what you know or what Joseph knows, wow.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. Thank you. This has been truly illuminating.
Well, thank you, Jon. You have a great day.
You too.
Bye.